Will you be seated for a few moments? I had mentioned earlier this is Commitment Sunday, so things are a little bit different. We have a shorter message, which at 11:13 you'll be appreciative, I know. And also at the end of that, a time of commitment where we're going to ask folks to commit to three things. One, will you pray for our church, as we have been, to stay united around our mission, to make, to baptize, and to teach followers of Jesus Christ. Second, will you pray that our church together takes steps of spiritual growth, that we commit to being a church that is maturing in our faith and inviting to those around us to see this is what maturity as a believer looks like. And then third, we're going to invite those of you who call Gospelife home to be committed to what we're doing over the next 30 months, to be committed financially, to give $1 million to missions. That's more than doubling our commitment to missions over the next 30 months. And to help us to build not only a building over our campus on Carroll Stream on North Coon Road by Glenbard North High School, but a worship space for us here, God willing, starting next summer, here for us on Gary Avenue. We're right by Wheaton North High School. We want to dedicate that space to the Lord. We will not ask the community to fund that. We're going to do what God stirs in the hearts of our people to do that. We'll give the opportunity to be a part of that at the end of our service. All right, now, if you have your Bibles, we're in Nehemiah chapter 12. If you've been around for a while, or if you've watched this online, and virtually everyone who visits has already watched this online a few times, we have been in a series called Meant for More. Meant for More is a series through the book of Nehemiah that teaches us that God has placed us where we are in our circumstances, within our sphere of influence, to make a difference. That we may face a problem to solve, a conflict to resolve, or an opportunity to seize. And we've been reading through Nehemiah's journal as he recounts what it was God stirred in his heart. And you may remember 12 weeks ago when we started this series, Nehemiah had a very secure, we might even say a cush job. High government official, one of the great ancient empires, Persia. And yet God broke his heart over the rubble and the trouble in Jerusalem, the city of his forefathers, and yet a city he had never visited. For 150 years, the city of Jerusalem, the capital of God's people, Israel in the Old Testament, had laid open to any kind of assault. The walls were down. The people, according to Nehemiah's own account, were in quote-unquote deep trouble. And God broke his heart. He stirred his heart to say, I want to be the one who will rebuild the city. What's amazing was nearly 200 years prior to that, one Old Testament prophet named Isaiah had prophesied, I will call you a rebuilder of fallen walls. Nehemiah is meant for more. That is his problem to solve, his conflict to resolve, his opportunity to seize, was to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that city could be what God intended it to be. A safe place for God's people to gather and worship and grow, and a light for the surrounding community to see what the power of God is to restore and make new. Nehemiah had made tremendous progress. We recognized he faced external threats, internal threats, personal threats, and yet we saw 2 weeks ago, he completed the wall. Within 2 months, 60 days of his arrival in Jerusalem, it was done. When we get to Nehemiah chapter 12, we're here for what's called the dedication of the wall. It's a whale of a celebration, service like we just had, where they celebrated God's faithfulness. After 150 years, the people of God gathered, secure with the wall around them, and they pointed to God's glory as the one who got that done. I can't help but think of Proverbs 19:13. A desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. I've heard from many of you, you've taken seriously our challenge to identify your own meant for more. That problem within your sphere of influence that you can solve. That conflict you're not afraid to lean into to try and resolve. Or that opportunity you may have been thinking about but afraid to execute on that you've begun to pursue. As I've heard from you, I recognize that your meant for more involves for some, a new path in life. For some, it's like a new educational opportunity. I'm going to do this thing that I've been thinking about, talking about, but not doing. For some, it's recognizing the courage to try something new. To launch out and try something that God stirred in your heart, weeks, months, maybe years, and you've breathed fire, you've breathed oxygen on the fire that God stirred in your heart That's cause to celebrate. For some, it's leaning into a painful relationship. For others, it's the freedom to pursue your God-given goals, your God-given gifts. Some of you are going to change for good the company where you work, the family in which you live, the school or the team in which you provide leadership. It's going to be different because you take seriously God's calling on your life to solve a problem, resolve a conflict, or seize an opportunity. You're meant for more. Now listen, if we capture the entire narrative arc of Nehemiah's story, 12 chapters, 13 chapters in his journal here, we recognize meant for more begins in your heart. You've been broken about something, or you have deep aspirations that drive you. You've discovered in the past few weeks the courage to say yes, to dream, to push, to invite others to be a part of that. Begins in your heart. It grows over time. In the face of all the conflict that Nehemiah was up against, he just doubled down. He just recognized, listen, problems are the price you pay for progress. And he kept moving forward on his meant for more to restore Jerusalem. Begins in your heart, grows over time, requires some help. Maybe this is one of the best things that come out of meant for more, is realizing we're pulling people around us and saying, hey, let's do this thing together. And it blesses others. Yes, there is a thrill, there is an energy around doing that thing God has created and called and gifted you to do. There is a deep sense of satisfaction in having experienced a hurt or a wrong or a disappointment, and knowing that God has placed you in a situation where you can actually do something to change that for your family or your school or your company or your team or this church. But it's not going to stop with benefiting you. It's going to overflow and benefit and bless others. This is what meant for more. Begins in our heart, grows over time, requires some help, and blesses others. And here's what I would say from Nehemiah chapter 12. If you have your copy of the scriptures, go there. Your meant for more is worth celebrating. Here's the thing, we're really good at making to-do lists. I don't know about you, for me, every Monday morning, write out my to-do list for the week. Do you know what I really am bad at doing? Celebrating getting some stuff done on that to-do list. So let's take a few moments today and see if we can't develop the biblical theology of celebrating, of recognizing there come seasons in life, if we're going to be leader, if we're going to sustain that leadership over time, if we're going to have a meant for more, accomplish a meant for more, and do the next thing, we're going to have to create some finish lines that we can celebrate. So Nehemiah chapter 12, celebrating the completion of the wall. In fact, we want to answer this question in our few minutes together here today. How do I celebrate my meant for more? And I know, because I've heard from you, some of you already are making steps towards completing your meant for more. Love that. Others of you are praying and planning and thinking and getting counsel on what your meant for more is. Don't back off of that. But when you make progress, when you accomplish that, it's time to celebrate. Look at Nehemiah chapter 12, beginning in verse 27. It is really the record of celebrating the dedication of the wall. Again, it had been accomplished in about 60 days. Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 27. We're going to read through the end of the chapter and look at one verse in chapter 13. And answer the question, how do I celebrate my meant for more? Let me give the first way. And by the way, you should celebrate your meant for more. Here's what we do. How do I celebrate my meant for more? Gather your partners. Right, I said anything's going to be significant in this life, you're not going to do all by yourself. And throughout this book, we've met a series of people that were friends of Nehemiah that helped him accomplish the thing that God called him to do. Now, look at Nehemiah 12, verse 27. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication. Now, by the way, twice the word dedication is used here. They're setting apart, dedicating this completed wall. And if you know anything of Jewish heritage, you'll recognize this word. It's the word Hanukkah. So there is actually a Jewish holiday, Hanukkah, which commemorates dedication. The word simply means to dedicate, or we might even say like a commencement, the wall. Now, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah is not, you use the same word, it's not after this, it's after something that happened about 250 years later in the very same place that Nehemiah was. They rededicated the wall yet again. What's happening is a setting apart, a celebrating something God had done in gathering the people together and completing this task. All right, so what did they do? Look at the end of verse 27 in Nehemiah 12. They're going to celebrate the dedication, here it is, with gladness, thanksgiving, singing, cymbals, harps, and lyres. Harps, think of a piano, but without the case around it. It's just strings on a wooden frame. Lyres is the Old Testament version of a guitar. 4 or 6 strings strung on a wooden neck, and you would pluck it or strum it. So they're going to have a worship service to dedicate this. Now, look at the list of people. I'm not going to read them to you, but look at verse 31. Then I brought the leaders of Judah. Oh, wait a minute. What do the next 4 words say? Up onto the wall. I don't know if you remember this, but in chapter 4, verse 3, as Nehemiah began building the wall, some of his enemies scoffed. And one of the criticisms they leveled at Nehemiah was, that wall is so tottery, that wall is so weak, if even a fox climbed up on the wall would collapse. You'll never convince me that Nehemiah didn't have enough healthy ego that when it came time to dedicate the wall, and by the way, archaeologists have discovered portions of this wall 10 feet wide. He said, I'm going to bring the leaders who helped build this wall, and we are going to march all around that bad boy. Fox schmucks, this wall is rock solid. Now, look at what happened. I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall, and I appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. Think of a July 4th parade. We know that there were at least 7 trumpeters for each of these choirs. All right, so it's a marching band with drums and choirs and musicians. Now look, verse 31, one went to the south on the wall, and after them, verse 32, went, and he names a bunch of people, and half of the leaders of Judah. What follows that list of names is a list of names of those who helped build the wall. Now listen. How good is it that when they celebrated the wall, and they would march in 2 groups around, one to the north, one to the south, all the way around the perimeter of the wall that just got built. And every time they took another step or 2, they stopped by somebody who had been building that wall. Their names, I can't even pronounce some of them. But they are not forgotten. Do you celebrate the people that have helped you? Have you gathered them together? They may not have a corner office in your company. They may be pretty far down the reporting chart. They may be the quiet person at your school or in your home. They may be the one that's not contributing the most to your team. But if you're a leader, you better point them out and give them the credit they deserve. In fact, look at what happened. This is just so remarkable that in one group, going to the north was Nehemiah, the governor. Another group was led by Ezra, who was the priest. And they marched all around that, celebrating. In fact, look at verse 36, the end of that. Ezra the scribe went before them. Verse 38, the other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them with half the people on the wall. Look at verse 40. Both of the choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God. They marched all the way around it, and they ended up right at the temple where they had a worship service. Now, Nehemiah, he was a business leader, went into politics as a governor. Ezra was a religious leader. He was a priest, the modern day equivalent of a scholar and a pastor. And I thought, what they did, they marched around, they celebrated Yeehaw. I thought maybe we'd do that. So, I don't know, Lori Hardy, you're a business leader. For you, it's medicine. Come on up here. Come on up here. Now, you're going to represent I have a cold. You might want to, I would pull you up otherwise, but we'll keep a few feet distant here, especially being in the medical field. I don't want you to have to miss any work or deliver any babies. So right there, okay. You, for the purpose of this illustration, are going to be Nehemiah. You can pull that off? All right, you're going to pull it off. And you're going to march to the north, around the back, and right back up the middle. Okay? I'll be Ezra. And I'm going to march to the south, right around here, and right back, we're going to come back up the middle aisle. Now, here's the thing, right? There's a whole list of names here because the people celebrated together. So it may be some of you are going to join Nehemiah, and some of you are going to join Ezra. And now we don't have trumpets, but we can do some cheering on the way. And we're just going to march around and bring it right back up here, all right? Anybody with us on this? All right, so let's do this thing. Let's begin celebrating. Come on now. Let's go. Hey, come on, Ezra. I need some help over. Get in the train. Let's go, go, go. And let's celebrate. Come on now. Come on, let's celebrate. We're going this way. We got the wall built. We're celebrating what God's doing here. The wall is built. People are gathering together. We're going to celebrate what God's doing. We're not going to let this moment pass. God's been good to us. Come on now. Let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate that. Come on, let's celebrate that, huh? Come on, come on, come on. All right, all right, all right. All right, all right, good. Come on, come on, come on. Celebrate, celebrate. Come on, let's make it happen. Come on, you're losing it. Don't forget celebrating. Come on, come on, come on. Yeah, that's right. We don't celebrate enough. Let's do it. Love that. Love that. Love that. That's so good. Come on. Come on, Kyle. Keep celebrating, baby. And listen, Nehemiah, all I'm saying is I'm looking at my side over here. I'm just saying. Not that it's a competition. Everything's a competition. Okay. Now, while they're celebrating and marching and all that, so listen, hear me. You do not celebrate enough. Party more. All right? Listen, you trust God for big things. You attempt some things for God that he's either going to come through or you're going to fall down on your face. And when he comes through, you celebrate like there's no tomorrow. And you can do it publicly. In fact, look at verse 40. The choirs, so both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God. Just like this, they gathered together. And look at what happened next. Look at the end of verse 42. The singers sang with that guy with the long name as their leader. By the way, worship leaders, musicians, those of you who have gifts of music, these two chapters are some of the most thorough in all the Old Testament about how important worship, music is to God's people. And how it needs to be organized and structured in such a way that it brings glory to God, brings excellence musically for God's people. And look at verse 43. And here's the second way. How do I celebrate my men for more? Gather together those who are your partners. You didn't do this alone? Give tons of credit. The more you open-handed and give credit to others, now listen to me. You lead an organization. You have an important responsibility to managing others. The higher you go in that organization, the more you need to be speaking into the lives and blessing those people that report up to you. And you will not sustain excellence in leadership until you can look and point at the people who are actually getting it done for you. That's humility. That's wisdom. It's God honoring. Now, but it doesn't end there. Look at what happens next. Look at verse 43. And there's just, you'll be able to pick it up. The cadence, the repetition 5 times of the theme of what happened in that square that day in Jerusalem. They offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. You know what I would do when I celebrate? I'd go all out. Seems silly marching around a gym. How much fun did you have? I go all out. 5 times. Rejoice, rejoice, joy, joy, rejoice. So much so, it wasn't just the old stuffy guys, the women and the children. Remember, the women and the children helped build the wall. Fathers and daughters, mothers and sons together. You go all out. About the time you think, I'm overdoing it and bringing encouragement to those around me, you're just getting started. Celebrate that. Parents, do your kids know the miracle stories of your family? The end of the verse says that the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. I take it that all those critics who'd been writing Nehemiah for months sort of had hang their head like, man, they sure do seem happy about what they accomplished. And my prayer is that in the community, this church is known as a church where there's joy. I'm not talking about silly happiness. Of course, we recognize the heaviness and the hurt that people bring. But that's not the topic today. On a regular basis, we should be celebrating God's faithfulness. And just so you're clear on the way we handle issues that are difficult issues politically or ethically or morally, or we stand firm on biblical convictions, but we want to be known in the community for what we're about, what we're for, not simply what we're against. This needs to be a place, because the joy of the Lord is our strength, that we are a joyful congregation, and that needs to be heard afar. How do I celebrate my Men for More? Gather your partners. Go all out. I like so much what Derek Kidner, he's a well-respected Hebrew scholar. It's actually in the study guide that tracked this series that we handed out. Kidner writes this, like, why it's just a wall. Yeah, well, it's way more than that, and so's your Men for More. Kidner writes this. Nehemiah tells his own invigorating story of rebuilding the city wall, outfacing his enemies, repopulating Jerusalem, and routing the traitors within his own camp. God's people were now more distinctly themselves, more Jewish than at any time of their previous existence. Out of the ruins of the little kingdom of Judah, there had emerged a small community whose concern to be the people of God shaped it into the nation which meets us in the New Testament. So that more than perhaps any other historical figure in Old Testament times of this era, Nehemiah prepared God's people for the arrival of Jesus the Savior. That's worth celebrating. Go all out. Lavish on your people gratitude, thanksgiving, pointing to God who brings it to pass. 3, how do I celebrate my Men for More? Gather your partners, go all out. 3, point to your legacy. Point to your legacy. Now, it took a little bit of detective work on my part, but I want you to hear one of my convictions is God's word matters. And things are in here for a reason. So when I got to verses 44 through 47, I had to do a little bit of work this week. On that day, look at verse 44. On that day, men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the firstfruits, the tithes, to gather them into the portions required by the law for the priests. Now look at the middle, or I guess it's near the end of verse 44. For Judah, that would be the people there, Judah rejoice over the priests and the Levites who minister. What's he saying? Well, after all this great celebration is over, Nehemiah gave attention to how do you organize a people of God to keep them on track. And what he did was he wanted to make sure the city was functioning so that after the big rah-rah party, they didn't just go back to things as normal. And so he organized the city. And what happened in this, we saw last week, there was spiritual renewal and revival. What happened is there was a warm relationship between the people of God and those who were charged with their spiritual care, the pastors and the priests. In fact, verse 44 I read before, Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. This is echoed in the New Testament book of Hebrews, where pastors and spiritual leaders and elders are challenged to do what they do out of joy. That the motivation to serve God's people should be a joyful one, not one of compulsion. And that should be reciprocated so that we should have joy over one another. That we have a relationship with one another, that we love and care for one another, and there's a time to celebrate that. And that points to legacy. In fact, look at the end of verse 45. And the singers and the gatekeepers, he's listing a whole bunch of people that made this worship service come together. Listen, look at the end of verse 45. According to the command of David and his son Solomon. Now throughout Nehemiah, that's really important. Legacy is important. That would have been 600 years prior to Nehemiah's time. And at this moment of dedication and celebration, Nehemiah didn't point to himself and say, see what I've done? He didn't invent something new. He said, I stand on the shoulders of faithful men and women who for hundreds of years have pointed to God's faithfulness. In fact, look at verse 46. For long ago in the days of David and Asaph was David's songwriter, musician, worship leader. There were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. Verse 47, and all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel, it's about 80 years ago, and in the days of Nehemiah, that's today. They provided for them. They set apart the Levites, for which the Levites were set apart as the sons of Aaron. You're meant for more. That thing God's stirring in your heart didn't start with you. You stand in a legacy of faithful men and women who have taken seriously their responsibility to share the good news of the gospel. So I turn the page and begin to think about, what does this mean for our church? Commitment Sunday. I recognize that we as a congregation are not that unique. For thousands of years, God's people have gathered together to celebrate and to rejoice over baptism and to hear God's word spoken and to sing songs of praise in whatever language they were living in. And we simply stand in that long line of faithful men and women. But we stand where we are today with the responsibility we have today to pass it forward, pass it along. I think of the room we're in here that was dreamt up way back in 2006. Almost none of you were here. Maybe very few of you gave to make this happen. And yet we benefit today, hundreds of us. This is the legacy that Nehemiah was pointing to. In fact, the very last verse of the book of Nehemiah, I just love how Nehemiah was concerned about that. Nehemiah 13:31. Listen. Here's Nehemiah's closing words. It's almost like a PS in his journal. Remember me, oh my God, for good. God, may my legacy be a good one. Summer of 2000, God was stirring in my heart about planning a church. I'd gather together a few people, right, pointing to those who were a part of this. And I hadn't told very many, just a few. We had some plans, but really hadn't got things off the ground when in December 23rd, year 2000, I'm in my office, this is Melrose Park. It's a dark, cold December day, getting ready for Christmas Eve service. Knock on the door. And I open the door, and two women are there, a middle-aged daughter and her older mother. And I knew them. They didn't attend our church, but I knew them. Wonderful family. Hey, come on in, sat down, and after a few moments, they're like, hey, Pastor Scott, we brought a little present for you for Christmas. Oh, thank you. And they opened a box, and there was this ceramic church. And like any man, I'm like, oh, thank you. They looked at me, and I looked at them, and I'm like, I will go ahead and get back to my studies now. And they recognized, I knew I was missing something, but I couldn't pick it out. And so finally they're like, hey, Scott, why don't you look inside the church? And I'm like, okay. And I saw there was a little rolled up this script here. And I opened it up, and it was a check for $50,000. They didn't go to our church. They said, we had a great year. Wanted to bless somebody. And we think God's going to do something special with a new church. That's legacy, 22 years ago. I was at the funeral for the mother who was a part of this a couple of years ago. I picked up the phone on that December 23rd, picked up the phone, called a friend, said, hey, you're never going to believe what just happened. We never even asked. People didn't even know. He's like, well, man, I was going to call you. Actually, I'm going to do some year-end giving. I've got $25,000 I'd like to add to that. I'm just like I just need to start making more phone calls, I guess. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money 22 years ago for sure. I'm telling you that story to say that that church, or that family that blessed the starting of this church, they went to a church that was started in 1949 by Italian immigrants coming over after World War II. That church was started by a church that was Italian immigrants that came after World War I in 1920. That church was started by a church in Italy where there's a movement of God and an outpouring of the Spirit of God and people being saved. You could trace that back to the book of Acts. I'm thankful for what God's doing in our church, and I pray that he continues, but we simply stand in a long line of faithful men and women. Men for More, for us corporately as a congregation, is about paying forward that legacy. When you commit to being a part of this, the three things we're asking you to commit to is to pray, to grow, and to give. When you invest in a building, it's a 50-year at least investment. So what we're going to do is we close our service together. We're going to invite you to be a part of Men for More. For some, you say, I'm going to commit to pray. Thank you. We stand in need of prayer. I'm going to commit to grow. And for some of you, call this church home. You've been around a while. You're like, you know what? To the degree that I'm willing, to the degree I'm able, I'm going to commit to give. Thank you for that. In fact, what we're going to do now is we're going to bring in some things to help us with this. You should have been given a prospectus here. I know, Angel, you see a handsome man on the front there. Pretty good. And in that, it tells you a little bit about our story. I think you'll enjoy that. There's also a commitment card in front of you. What we would invite you to do is take a moment. Maybe you've already done this. Some of you have already done it online, I know. And commit to being a part of our church. To the degree you can, commit to being a part of Men for More. Now, let me ask Pastor Austin, Pastor Ben Pearson to come on up here. We spent about 90 minutes together yesterday talking through today and praying together about specifically like, how are we going to do this thing? And so in just a moment, we're going to invite you to make your way up front here. And if you haven't already filled out, take a moment to fill out a commitment card. And you're going to slip it right in these really high-tech boxes that we have here. And then we're going to ask you to pick up on your way past here a rock. Now, I went and got mine last night, washed it off. It's kind of dusty. This rock is that, the Bible calls it a stone of remembrance. The Hebrew word Ebenezer is translated in English as Ebenezer. It's something that we have that points to the faithfulness of God. When you walk out, there's a fireplace in the atrium there, and some of the stones in there were stones that we prayed over right here in 2006. And then people took them home with them for 2 years while we built, And when we put the fireplace in, we asked them to bring the stones back, and we built it into the fireplace to remind us of God's faithfulness. When you take these stones with you, put them on your desk, put them in your car, put them in your home, take some for your children to remind them, and pray. Pray for the next 2 years as we're in the process of developing and building. And then we'll let you know when it's time. Bring them back, and we're going to build that stone into the new building. We want it to be a living testimony to God's faithfulness and your prayers being answered. But the question's often like, Austin, how do I know if I should be a part? How do I know about giving? How do I know, Pastor Ben, about what to give? Biblical principles of giving, there are 2 boundaries on that. Number 1, willingness. Old Testament, New Testament, willingness. Do it because you want to or don't do it. It's okay, it's okay. You commit, you're great. You don't commit, you're great. You be a part of our church family. Do not feel like, oh, I can't go there anymore, I'm embarrassed. No. Like God, He's got this. The second part is able. So I'm willing and I'm able. I've so ordered my life or disciplined my finances that I have the capacity to do that. So willingness and ability. But Pastor Austin, talk to us about how you and your wife, Emily, have landed on a number or how you're going to do that.
Yeah, for us, it started with just the recognition that everything that we have is the Lord's, that He has given it to us. And in Malachi, there's this text that talks about putting God to the test and see if He will not outpour His blessing on us. And so we gave to putting God to the test, which was a little uncomfortable and it hurt. And there were some sacrifices we had to make. And the reason for that is really twofold. One is we've been part of this dream ever since my wife was on staff 7+ years ago as a children's director of knowing that the vision was to always have that dedicated worship center. And so for us, this is a dream now finally being realized. And the second is a lot more personal to us, and that's just really that there's been a deep spiritual impact that my wife and my family, my boys and myself have experienced here at Gospelife. I mean, my wife, she was actually baptized here when we were still dating by you, Pastor Scott. I preached my first sermon on this stage, and it wasn't very good, but God's people were very gracious. And then my 2 boys that are with me today that are going to come help deliver our commitment card, they've been dedicated on this stage here. And so there's been just a deep spiritual impact in my life. Yeah. And I just know that there's families that deserve that as well. And so my family want to put God to the test and really give till it's uncomfortable so that other families can have the same spiritual deep impact that I've received. I
love that sense of legacy. It's funny, at the end of the first service, I was like one of the last families to come up and take a rock. It was a kid who had to have been about this tall. He this total guy thing. He picked up the biggest rock he could, and he's walking like this path. I just said, that's the best thing I've seen all day today, man. That's great. Ben, you and Noel, been part of our church a long time. How did you 2 have the conversation? How did you navigate how to commit?
Yeah, and so for me, as I've just had the blessing of attending so many small groups to kind of talk through this campaign and Meant for More, I've heard a lot of stories along the way, and for some folks, they have decided to make Gospelife their church home, and but not yet begun giving to the church, and that's an opportunity at this time to join in financially, to participate in the discipline of generosity. For others, they do give. They've been giving, faithfully for a long time, but that might come out of the excess or when there's a flush month or the extra paycheck or however that might work, and so the next step of growth for some folks would be to begin that discipline of tithing, that spiritual discipline of giving first fruits. For my wife and I, we've tithed for years. And so a lot of conversation went into, what does Gospelife mean to us? And what is our potential here? And we've kind of decided that when we get into our 70s, my brother lives in Florida, and every year about this weather, when it gets cold for the first time, I get the call from him, and he's like, hey, is this year we're going to go catch redfish? And so someday it's going to happen. I'm going to head to Florida and catch redfish. But this opportunity to leave a legacy here.
Yeah.
And that's what we talked about. And so we're going to move to Florida someday, but the gospel is going to continue to go forward in this community as a result of this.
Yeah. So your 70s would be about 30 years from now. Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So Pastor Austin, Pastor Ben both mentioned this idea of tithing. That's something my wife Vicki and I have also for decades practiced. I recognize like we're not normal, and I mean that in a lot of senses, but obviously as pastors and leaders, we want to lead the way on that. For some of you, you're like, yep, we're there, we can do that. Thank you, God bless you. For others, as Pastor Ben said, maybe it's whatever that next step would be in the discipline of giving. The grace of giving is what the New Testament calls it. To the degree you can, to the degree you're willing, we'd invite you to do that. My encouragement to you would be, as Pastor Austin said, you cannot outgive God, and so we'd encourage you to take him up on that. But hear what I'm saying, willingness, it begins with that. We will never coerce. We will never use guilt or false motives to try and generate giving. I've never felt like my job is to pry donations from unwilling people. We simply want to point the generous God that he is and invite us to imitate that in our own lives. So what we're going to do, Alton is going to come and sing over us for just a couple of moments. And then when you feel led to do that, we're going to invite you to come up to the front. You can put the commitment card in there. Some of you say, well, wait a minute, I've already committed online. Thank you for that. Pastor Ben has some sort of secret sauce. I don't know how it works exactly, but as a part of worship, as a part of commitment, will you go ahead and drop a commitment card in? It will not double your commitment, all right? So we're not going to do that to you. But we just want to participate together as a family of God in this moment of celebrating, this moment of dedicating the next chapter of life of Gospelife Church. We want you to be a part of that. So Alton's going to sing over us. As you feel the stirring, the willingness to do that, come on up, make a commitment. Grab some of these grab a rock or two, a stone. Make sure you use that then to pray. You say, you know what? I'm not ready to make a commitment yet. Well, will you please come and get a stone? Because we stand in need of prayer and would love for you to partner with us in that way as well. All right? So let's take a few moments to do that. And then find your seats again. We're going to close our service in just a couple of minutes with a song that's been a theme of this entire series, Same God.